The moon hangs like a lazy lantern above the palace eaves, casting a pale, buttery glow on the silent courtyards of the Southern Song dynasty. The breeze tonight doesn't rush its strolls. You feel it curl around your ear, patient and unbothered, like it knows there's nowhere urgent to be. It smells faintly of pine smoke and fermented plums. Somewhere, a bamboo wind chime creaks like an old man settling into his second nap of the evening. The soft murmur of water trickling through a garden stream tries to keep you awake, but not very hard. You're in Hangzhou, the imperial capital, 12th century. The dynasty's old bones are beginning to ache from wars they didn't win. But the city itself is still a graceful swirl of silks, lacquered fans, and scholars trying to outpoem each other before bed. Tonight, you're standing beneath a carved wooden gate, waiting to enter a rather unusual gathering. Emperor Gaozonghu used to command armies, and now mostly commands. The pacing of his pet craners invited a select few courtiers, alchemists, monks, and ghosts, to his latest obsession. Tea tastings for the dead. You probably won't make it through this day. Before we begin, you're gently encouraged, no pressure, to like and subscribe. It helps the channel, and somewhere, maybe even soothes a poet's spirit. And if you feel like it, drop your location and what time it is where you are. We'll try not to haunt you. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. The palace itself is quiet, as if it's holding its breath. You walk through a corridor that smells of jasmine wax and rain-polished wood. Paintings on silk float along the walls, their colors half-faded, their stories barely whispering. A servant passes you, a blur of blue robes and wide eyes, and disappears around a corner. He's probably off to polish the emperor's ghost. Cups again. Yes, those are real. Delicate porcelain bowls made specially for the spirits of deceased poets, sealed with cinnabar glaze and meant to warm spectral hands. Historians still debate whether these tastings were sincere spiritual rituals or just a very elaborate way of avoiding political meetings. The emperor, after all, had been through quite a bit. He'd seen the north fall to the Jurchens, lost his father, and had to build a new court from scratch down south. Having tea with the dead Mitov felt like the calmer option. As you enter the tea hall, the floor shifts under your feet. It's not unstable, just old, like a wise, creaky friend. Paper lanterns hang low, brushing the tops of the guests' hair like affectionate ghosts. Every table has been set with tiny tea dishes, red candles, and a slip of poetry in barely legible calligraphy. Some poems are from famous dead men, others are from guests who are not yet dead, but clearly auditioning. You take your place at the back. No one notices. That's the benefit of being the dreamer in this scene, comfortably unseen. Observant, but never awkwardly offered fermented tofu. A monk chants softly in a corner, more for ambience than religion. And finally, the emperor enters. He is older than the scrolls say, his beard white like rice paper left too long in the sun. His robe a tapestry of dragons who seem like they've also had a long week. He lifts a cup. To Li-Bai, he says, and to those who no longer get a seat at the table. You sip. The tea tastes faintly of pine smoke and regret. Some say he hired a medium to interpret the ghost responses. Others say he just nodded whenever the candle flickered. There's a scratching sound near the window. A palace cat hops in, entirely uninterested in the supernatural. Unless ghosts drop snacks. One nobleman starts explaining the spiritual acidity of oolong. Another claims he heard a sigh from the ghost of a 10th dynasty waitress. Everyone nods. No one questions it. The night drips by like sap from a peach tree, slow, sweet, slightly sticky, and still the emperor listens. Maybe he believes, or maybe he's just found the quietest place in his kingdom. The next morning arrives without drama, no rooster, no fanfare, just the slow, warm breath of light on silk curtains, and the faint rustle of someone sweeping leaves that fell 6 hours too early for fall. You're in a small guest chamber now, probably repurposed from some forgotten scroll archive. The bed is firm in that historical way that says posture over pleasure, and the pillow smells lightly of cedar and whatever else you don't want to identify. Outside, a servant is feeding tea leaves to koi fish. It's not part of their diet. But the emperor read somewhere that fish can inherit emotions through flavor. No one argued. The palace, though elegant, is always a little out of sync with time. Scholars draft poetry on bark scrolls while using bronze mirrors to fix their hats. One man is still trying to invent a musical instrument that mimics the sound of a melancholic goose. He's close. Today is Spirit Accountancy Day, an annual tradition where the emperor's scribes tally which ghosts have visited in the last year. They keep these in ledgers bound with silk, and this is true, weighted with tiny bells so spirits don't sneak in extra names. Historians still debate whether this was purely symbolic or part of a larger metaphysical census project. Either way, the scribe with the inkwell tattoo and no eyebrows seems to be enjoying himself far too much. You wander the corridors again. The floorboards remember you and groan accordingly. In the garden, an old eunuch feeds persimmons to a squirrel. He claims the squirrel is the reincarnation of a Jin dynasty general. You don't question him. You've seen stranger hierarchies. As you pass the poetry ponder, place where officials throw in written verses and hope they float, someone shouts that one just caught fire. This is taken as a good omen, or a very literary haunting. The emperor appears around midday in a robe that smells faintly of camphor and nostalgia. He's heading to the ancestral shrine to deliver tea, not to drink, to pour onto the floor. For the dead you follow. The shrine is carved of stone so smooth it looks like moonlight got frozen mid-spill. Inside there are rows of ancestral tablets, each marked with calligraphy sharp enough to slice air. The incense smells like cinnamon and old paper. The emperor kneels. He whispers things you can't quite hear, except for one phrase: they remember better than we do. Then he pours the tea slowly. The liquid pools like a second shadow beneath the tablet of his mother. A bird calls in the distance, one of those elegant, overachieving birds that sounds like it's trying to audition for heaven. You wonder, as the emperor stands again, if all of this is performance, or if, just maybe, the ghosts are better listeners than the living. There's a cultural footnote worth knowing. In this period, it was believed that unremembered spirits could cause headaches, lost keys, or unusually bad rice, so the tea rituals weren't just sentimental, they were insurance. And tonight, there's a new event scheduled, a séance conducted entirely in verse. You're not expected to participate, but you'll want to watch, or at least drift into sleep while listening, because here, in this palace of forgotten poems and remembered ghosts, history doesn't shout, it sips, and it lingers, just like you. By evening, the halls are swept again, though they didn't really need it. Dust here behaves like a polite guest, never overstays, never questions why it's not welcome. A slight floral scent fills the air, lavender perhaps, or the ghost memory of someone's long-dead bathwater. You're walking down a side corridor you didn't notice yesterday. The walls lean in just slightly, like they're eavesdropping on your footsteps. Carvings line the panels, scenes of people pouring tea, people spilling tea, and one confused goat that no one's been able to explain. This corridor leads to the Garden of Echoes, named not for its acoustics, but for the peculiar belief that if a ghost had something unfinished to say, its words might show up in flower petals. Scholars are still on the fence about whether that's metaphor or method. Tonight's poetry sale is being held here. Low tables rest beneath drooping plum trees, whose branches dip so close to the earth it feels like they're trying to nap. Cushions arranged in a rough circle give the space an accidental intimacy, like everyone's been invited to a deeply awkward family reunion where at least half the guests don't have pulse. You settle onto a cushion, no one notices. As usual, this is a gift. The Emperor enters, later than expected, but not enough for anyone to complain. He wears deep maroon robes, embroidered with clouds, cranes, and what might be a confused goat. Apparently, it's a motif now. At the center of the gathering, a calligrapher begins slowly inking a scroll, each stroke deliberate, like he's writing not for speed, but for the approval of someone who lives under a floorboard. The first verse is read aloud. It's about longing. Most are. A few lines in, a gust of wind tosses a single candle sideways. People pause. The Emperor nods solemnly. That's considered a reply. You hear a few stifled, cough-polite ones. The kind that mean I'm still awake, I promise. One minister scribbles a poem so fast his brush splits in two. Another quietly dozes, mouth slightly open, dreaming probably of being more interesting. Here's your historical fact for the night. Emperor Gaozong reigned for over 30 years, but abdicated in favor of his son while still pulling the strings from behind the curtain. In official documents, he was still called retired emperor, which might be the most overqualified retirement in world history. He also believed and publicly insisted that poetry had political power, especially when offered to the unseen. It was less about rhyme and more about ritual. Tonight, a eunuch reads a verse, said to be from the spirit of a drowned concubine. You can't help but notice the way everyone looks at their tea afterward, as if expecting it to speak. At one point, a black cat walks directly through the center of the circle. No one dares stop it. In palace superstition, a cat interrupting ritual was a sign of strong spiritual reception, or failing that, someone forgot to feed it. Historians still debate whether these seances were regularly held or only became fashionable when the courts ran out of other forms of entertainment. One scholar suggested it was cheaper than commissioning another. Porcelain Bridge. The session winds down with a closing poem from the emperor himself. It's about loss, not the dramatic kind, more the quiet, everyday kind. Like realizing someone's voice has slipped from memory. It ends with a line that stays with you. Even the ghosts wait for spring. You walk back to your room slowly, the candle in your hand flickering like it's holding back commentary. And the night feels a little more crowded now, but in a comforting way. Asterisk, you wake to the sound of someone arguing with a goose. It's not clear who started it, but it's escalating. You rise, stretch, and step out into the morning mist. Everything smells vaguely like pine, damp stone, and last night's poetic overreach. The goose argument has relocated to the far end of the courtyard, which seems like a good decision for everyone involved. Today, you're invited to the imperial kitchens. Not for eating, of course, not but to observe preparations for the offerings banquet, a twice-monthly event where food is cooked solely for the deceased. You walk past a cluster of palace staff, deep in discussion about whether or not ghosts prefer their duck boiled or braised. A cook insists on sesame oil. Another swears by plum vinegar. A third points out that since no one eats it, flavor is probably a non-issue. The kitchen itself is a flurry of ritual chaos: bronze woks, enormous steamers, rows of knives so polished they could reflect your Soland maybe do. Here's tonight's weird cultural tidbit. One of the assistant chefs wears a red ribbon around his wrist, not for fashion, but because the dead apparently don't like red. It's how he ensures the offerings aren't accidentally consumed by a curious phantom on the way out. At the edge of the room, a small girl, probably a servant's daughter, sits painting eyes onto rice cakes, 2 dots each. It's symbolic, allegedly, so the spirits can see the food. Historians still debate whether this practice was widespread or limited to Honjo's quirkier court. The argument mainly hinges on a single imperial recipe book, annotated in the margins with what looks like nervous laughter. The emperor arrives midway through the preparations. He inspects the dumplings, says nothing, then points to a tray of steamed lotus buns and simply says, more wistful. No one asks for clarification. Somehow, they know. You're handed a chilled cup of chrysanthemum tea. The cup is too cold, the tea too floral, but you sip anyway. It's tradition. Outside the kitchen, a white-robed official is burning slips of gold leaf. Not for money, for respect. In the afterlife, paper gold still carries weight. And besides, the emperor insists that every spirit, regardless of rank, deserves a living wage. Later in the day, the food will be carried silently, reverently to the hall of wind offerings, placed on lacquered trays, and left overnight. By morning, it will be removed, untouched. Except for one time when a peach went missing. No one talks about that day. You're allowed to watch the offering procession. The sun sets during it, slowly, like it, too, is trying to show respect. One court musician plays a single note on a bamboo flute as the dishes are set down. The note is long, low, and slightly off-key, which, ironically, might make it more appealing to the dead. The emperor bows before the trays, then steps back. A monk mumbles a blessing that sounds suspiciously improvised. No one minds. The gesture matters more than the grammar. And just as the last tray is placed, a wind picks up, gentle, intentional. You feel it curl around your ankles like cool silk, and in that moment, you wonder just briefly if someone unseen is really there, or if it's just the way history touches back. Dawn doesn't so much arrive as politely tap on the horizon. The sky unfolds in layers, pale gold near the rooftops, bruised lavender, further out like someone dipped the city in a watercolor set and walked away mid-project. You stand at the edge of the lotus pond, your reflection sleepy and uncommitted. A fish blinks at you. You're not sure if it's judging or just very bad. At blinking. The palace feels unusually still this morning, as if it knows something you don't, which it does. Several things, actually. But for now, you're being gently led to the Library of Lost Names. It's not on the official map. A narrow passage behind a folding screen. You only find it because a monk with eyebrows like two gentle commas tells you it's where the forgotten get catalogued. Inside, the air smells of ink, sandalwood, and mild defiance. Stacks of bamboo scrolls, silk-bound records, and faded portraits line the walls like awkward family members at a reunion. No one fully remembers agreeing to attend. The librarian, her robe, the color of rain clouds, welcomes you with a whisper. Not because it's a rule, but because, here, Silence is less a policy and more a personality. She leads you to a scroll table where names are being inked by hand, painstakingly, names of people whose stories didn't quite make it into the official records. Minor poets, failed alchemists, a man who claimed to have invented moonlight. Your historical fact of the day. During the Song dynasty, archival work was deeply respected. Record keepers were often scholars, and bureaucratic roles related to information were considered more honorable than military ones. Paper held more power than the sword, especially if the ink was expensive. As the librarian dips her brush again, she mentions the tea of continuance, a brew said to help the living remember forgotten souls at least for a night. Ingredients include lotus root, crushed sandalwood, and regret. She offers you a sip. It tastes like earth and old tears. Scholars still debate whether this tea was ceremonial, medicinal, or just another way to make sadness go down easier. Nearby, a wall is covered in embroidered patches, one for each unnamed person whose memory survives only through reference, someone's cousin, a passing mention in a poem, a subject of gossip in a third-hand diary, and in one corner, framed in dark wood, is a delicate fan. On it, a single line: the quieter the soul, the longer it stays. The librarian doesn't explain. She doesn't need to. As you leave, you realize the corridor feels shorter on the way out. Or maybe the scrolls just shifted again to keep their secrets better tucked. Back outside, the garden is bathed in buttery light. A palace scribe is writing today's horoscope on a wooden plank. Avoid deception. Embrace noodles. The ghosts are listening. You're not sure if that's specific advice or just a mood. Either way, you nod and continue walking. Midday heat settles over the palace like a soft towel draped across your shoulders. Pleasant, slightly damp, and definitely not asking permission. The hum of cicadas rises from the trees like an unending gossip session, high-pitched, persistent, and oddly comforting. You find yourself in the pavilion of listening breezes. The emperor holds his more unusual meetings here, including today's, a philosophical debate between a Confucian scholar, a Taoist monk, and a man who insists the moon is made of pressed rice and divine sadness. The audience is a mix of curious officials, tired servants pretending to care, and one flute player who is clearly composing a breakup ballad mid-debate. The emperor reclines on a cushion, sipping Osmantha's wine. He isn't moderating, just observing. Like someone watching koi fish argue about taxes, the Confucian begins with structure and duty. The Taoist counters with nature and flow. The moon theorist offers poetry, bad poetry, but heartfelt, your historical fact for the hour. Song emperors, especially Gaozon, were patrons of not just the arts, but also spirited debate. Intellectual salons were common, with emperors often sitting in to observe or, if the tea hit just right, contribute verses. The breeze does, in fact, listen. The gauzy silk banners hanging from the rafters flutter softly whenever someone makes a good point, or a terrible one. It's hard to tell. You sit cross-legged near the koi pond, watching a fish try to eat a falling leaf and fail spectacularly. No one tells it. Let it dream. Halfway through the debate, a servant interrupts with a scroll labeled Urgent Meteor. Apparently, a bright light was seen in the northern sky last night. The monk declares it an omen. The scholar says it's a distraction. The poet cries and blames unrequited celestial love. The emperor chuckles. That's about as much input as you'll get from him today. Here's a strange tidbit. In this era, people believed loud sneezes during philosophical debates could scare away intrusive spirits. So occasionally, someone sneezes loudly and then apologizes for the ghost. Historians still debate whether this tradition was genuine or just a polite way to fake allergies when bored as the sun begins its slow descent. The debate dissolves into shared wine, soft laughter, and the quiet shuffle of cushions being rearranged for napping. Someone starts humming a lullaby older than the dynasty. No one knows the words. Everyone knows the tune. You lean back, letting the sound, the silk-soft breeze, and the warm scent of plum wine settle into your bones. The emperor's voice drifts toward you, not loud, not directed. Even arguments can be offerings, and the banners flutter. Just a little asterisk. Evening sidles into the palace like a cat with damp feet, quiet, unavoidable, and faintly amused by your confusion. The sun doesn't set so much as recline, slipping behind the rooftops like it's had a long day pretending to be important. Tonight, there's a lantern ritual, not the festive kind with children running wild and vendors selling dumplings shaped like rabbits. This one's quieter, older, a ritual reserved for honoring those who never found their way. Home soldiers lost in distant campaigns, messengers never returned, lovers who promised they'd write but didn't. You join the slow procession down to the willow-lined edge of Westlake. Each person holds a paper lantern shaped like a lotus flower. Some are white, others soft pink, all glowing from within, their little flames flickering like shy wishes. The emperor walks near the front. His robe is trimmed with silver thread that catches the lantern light and reflects it faintly like even. His clothes are remembering someone. You're handed a lantern. It's lighter than you expect, and it smells of rice paper and clove oil. A monk offers you a brush. Write a name, he says, even if you're the only one who remembers it. You think for a moment, then write. The lanterns are released, one by one, onto the water. They bob gently, drifting outward like stars who forgot they were supposed to stay in the sky. Here's your historical fact for this passage. The Southern Song dynasty, despite its military shortcomings, was renowned for the refinement of rituals around grief and remembrance. Loss was not hidden, it was structured, named, folded gently into ceremony. A hush falls over the crowd. Not total silence, but that particular quiet that belongs to sacred things. The only sounds are the soft lapping of water, the occasional cough, and the very distant squabble of two ducks that haven't read the room. A servant whispers that one of the lanterns turned around and floated back to shore. It's considered either a very bad omen or a ghost with social anxiety. Scholars still debate the deeper meanings behind these floating lanterns. Were they symbolic gestures, practical spirit guides, or merely moments for the living to let go in manageable pieces? You sit on a stone bench as the procession breaks apart. Some return to the palace. Others linger, watching the lake become a soft shimmer of lights and shadows. You stay, not for duty, for stillness, and for the way grief can look beautiful. Just for a moment, when it drifts. The next morning brings fog, thick as broth and twice as insistent. It curls through the courtyards, wraps around trees, and makes even the most confident birds consider staying quiet. You navigate by sound, now soft footsteps, murmured greetings, the distant clink of teacups and porcelain lids. Today, you've been invited, well, more like guided to the chamber of errant dreams. It's not as ominous as it sounds. It's just where dreams are recorded. Yes, recorded in this part of the palace. Scribes sit in long rows, listening to monks, guards, maids, even the emperor. recount their dreams from the night before. These are inked carefully onto silk slips and stored by category: prophetic, absurd, culinary, and same one again. The logic: dreams, like ghostly tea guests, may be trying to say something, or nothing, but it's safest to write it down, just in case. You sit beside one of the scribes. He's young, slightly ink-stained, and smells faintly of sesame buns. Today he's transcribing a dream about a talking turtle who explains tax reform. The turtle wore a scholar's hat. Everyone nods like this is normal. Historical fact time. In the Southern song, dreams were often taken seriously in both popular and political life. There were officials assigned to interpret them, and major decisions from military campaigns to garden layouts were occasionally influenced by what someone saw in their sleep. Nearby, an elderly courtier describes dreaming of a peach pit that wouldn't crack open. A monk mutters, fear of legacy. The scribe writes, unresolved matter, peach-related. You are offered a chance to contribute. You consider making something up, but somehow it feels disrespectful. So you describe last night's vision: glowing lanterns, an empty chair, and the sound of water that spoke but didn't use words. The scribe nods solemnly and writes, return of unsummoned ancestor. Emotional temperature, warm. Here's your obscure tidbit. In this palace, it's considered unlucky to ignore recurring dreams involving carp. Some believe carp are messengers of unspoken family business. Others just really like fish. Historians still debate whether the dream archive was meant for true spiritual insight, or was just a very elaborate way to avoid morning meetings. As the scribes file the scrolls into lacquered boxes, one slips and lands open on your lap. It's a dream written by the emperor years ago, only for characters. She waited. I didn't. You close the scroll gently. Sometimes remembering is the bravest thing people do here. The fog outside begins to lift, curling upward like a ghost, remembering it has somewhere else to be. And once again, the palace breathes. Asterisk. Midday arrives reluctantly, like a clerk returning from an unsatisfying lunch. The sky stays a hazy grey, the kind that doesn't quite commit to gloom, but certainly isn't trying to cheer anyone up. You find yourself drifting toward the gallery of celestial maps, a quiet wing of the palace, known mostly for its dusty scrolls, underused star charts, and one suspiciously cracked sundial that keeps accurate time only when ignored. The gallery is cool, dim, and filled with the smell of ink, wood oil, and gentle disappointment. Inside, enormous silk maps hang from the ceiling like sleeping sails. The stars are inked in gold thread, forming constellations you barely recognize: phoenix, toad, vermilion bird, and one called the drunk scholar falling into a river, which may not be metaphor. A scholar in soft linen robes greets you with a nod. He's the palace's appointed heaven reader, a man paid to track the moods of the stars and gently suggest how emperors might react to them. He has the distracted air of someone who just spilled secrets into the sky and hopes no one noticed. He shows you a fresh chart from last night's viewing. A comet, faint but noticeable, was spotted over the western quadrant. This, he says, with grave sincerity, means either an upcoming harvest or a minor scandal involving ducks. You nod, as if either would surprise you any more. Your historical fact. For today, the Song dynasty placed significant importance on celestial observation, both for agriculture and governance. Astronomers were part of the state bureaucracy, and new star sightings were logged, reported to the emperor, and occasionally accompanied by incense offerings. It was science. But poetic science. Over in a corner, two apprentices are arguing softly about whether one constellation looks more like a mythical sword or just a very confident shrimp. Their teacher ignores them. The heaven reader rolls out a map labeled correspondence. Between ghost movements and lunar mood, it's filled with neat little ink dots, swirls, and the occasional emoji-like expression drawn into the margins. He doesn't explain those. Scholars still debate whether these charts had practical use or if they were a comforting placebo for uneasy rulers. Some say Emperor Gaozong took them seriously. Others think he just liked the gold thread. You're handed a small star scroll to carry for spiritual alignment. It doesn't seem heavy, but it feels ... aware ... as you leave the gallery. You look up at the real sky, only to realize it's begun raining lightly mist, really, the kind that seems to fall upward just as much as down. A guard offers you a paper umbrella. It has constellations inked on the underside. You open it, step out, and suddenly, for just the breath of a moment, the world feels charted, even if no one quite knows the destination. Morning doesn't so much arrive as it sneaks in like it forgot it had an appointment. The sun stretches a lazy arm across the rooftops, and someone 2 streets over begins banging pots in what might be breakfast preparation or a percussion rehearsal. Either way, your awake today feels heavier, not in a dramatic way, just in the way history sometimes does when it piles too gently to notice. A message arrives folded silk, sealed with wax shaped like a moth. It invites you to join the emperor on a visit to the temple of misremembered saints. You blink, misremembered. The temple sits on the edge of the city, barely clinging to its title. It's old, even by the palace's standards. Its steps sag in the middle like they've grown tired of being stepped on. The monks here specialize in honoring saints whose names have been lost, altered, or confused beyond recognition. Inside, the air smells of old incense and rice wine left out too long. Candles flicker, not quite bright enough to compete with the daylight slinking through paper windows. You walk slowly, careful not to disturb the silent soar, the pigeons sleeping in the rafters. The emperor stands at the altar, holding a small bowl of tea in both hands. His robe today is plain, almost austere, but there's a single embroidered plum blossom stitched just above the hem. Possibly a secret, possibly a mistake. Your historical fact, the Song dynasty, while deeply rooted in Confucian order, also inherited layers of folk belief and Buddhism, leading to a complex system of saint-like figures, many of whom were never canonized, just affectionately remembered until no one could quite say why. The monks here chant the names they still have, some partially preserved in weathered stone, others guessed from poems or grocery lists. Here's your cultural tidbit. Once a year, the temple performs a ritual called the Offering of Apologies, where they bow to statues and say, "We're sorry if we got your story wrong." No one knows if it helps, but it's comforting. The emperor sets the tea down on the altar. He bows, not quickly, not performatively, just gently. You wander through the back hall, where faded tapestries hang like overtold stories. One depicts a woman riding a crane, another shows a man wrestling a scroll. A third is just a pair of shoes under a tree. No one knows why. Historians still debate whether this temple had imperial patronage or if it simply endured by existing in a place no one ever got around to tearing down. Either way, it feels alive in that half-dreaming way certain places do. You sit on a cool stone bench outside, beneath a tree whose leaves fall one at a time, like they're testing gravity. And you think, maybe, memory doesn't have to be perfect to be worth keeping. Maybe just trying is holy enough. A bell rings somewhere, deep in the temple's low, heavy, forgiving. You stay a while longer. So does the silence. Afternoon drapes itself over the palace like a silk robe, 3 sizes, too large, soft, luxurious, and always getting in the way. The corridors are half lit, half dozing. Even the shadows seem to be napping against the walls, occasionally shifting like cats, dreaming of being bigger cats. Today's itinerary, if one can call it that, involves a visit to the imperial wardrobe, not to pick out clothes, though the idea of trying on ghost-themed robes is amusing, but to observe a more peculiar tradition. Dressing the ancestors, you arrive at a chamber filled with folded fabric and the hushed chaos of seamstresses, tailors, and one disgruntled dye master arguing with a spool of indigo silk. It's a place that smells of starch, cedar, and ambition. Here's your historical fact. The song Imperial Court placed surprising emphasis on ritual garments, not just for the living, but for the dead. Seasonal ceremonies included offerings of full ceremonial outfits, robes, sashes, even shoes tailored precisely to a spirit's rank and remembered personality. A long table nearby holds labeled stacks: poet, mid-career, warlord, reluctantly spiritual, uncle probably. You're handed a bolt of cloth mist grey with subtle gold threads and asked to bring it to the embroiderer of names. She's ancient, hunched, and possibly been sewing since the Tang dynasty. Her needles move faster than her words, and she sews each name backward so the dead can read it from the other side. She shows you a robe stitched for the emperor's mother. It's lined with silk feathers and smells faintly of plum blossoms. The inside hem is embroidered with a poem 7 characters long. You don't ask what it says, but the silence around it feels personal. There's a small, strange tradition here. If a needle breaks while sewing for the dead, it's buried in a box of ash and never reused. Superstition, maybe, but no one's taking chances. Scholars still debate whether these garments were burned in full ceremony, buried in secret, or simply tucked away in sealed chests, like memories too dear to wear again. You follow a quiet procession to the ancestral hall, where the robes are laid gently at the feet of carved tablets. The emperor steps forward, adjusts a collar on a robe like he's tucking someone into a dream. Outside, the wind picks up suddenly. It isn't cold, but it wants you to notice it. You do. A servant lights sandalwood incense, and the flame curls upward, not straight, but like it's looking for someone, and the robe's empty, motionless seem just a little less still. Evening is a slow exhale, the kind that follows a memory, or a meal, or both. You're seated now in the Hall of Whispered Records, a curious little room tucked behind the main library, filled with scrolls that were never meant for official eyes. These are the personal journals, the unsent letters, the just in case I die tomorrow writings, the whisperings of history, not its declarations. A eunuch with excellent posture explains the purpose of the room: to keep alive the small truths, the ones that don't make it into royal decrees or epic poems, but still mattered to someone. He hands you a scroll, yellowed and soft, titled Only. For her, if she still remembers my name, you don't read it. You don't need to. Here's your historical fact. The Song dynasty was a golden age of personal writing. The rise of inexpensive paper and an expanding literate class meant more people kept journals. exchanged intimate letters, and wrote things that didn't rhyme and didn't need to. One record here contains the musings of a court gardener. He wrote daily entries about which plants seemed moodier than usual. Another is a single line: "I saw a woman today who walked like memory." You pass a scroll that's been rewritten 3 times, each version shorter. The final version says only, "I am sorry, I lived." The air smells of dust, dry ink, and camellia oil, and something else, maybe old feelings. Those always linger longer than parchment. An odd cultural note. Once a month, the emperor himself comes here to read one scroll at random. He never says which one. He just folds it back up, replaces it gently, and lights a candle. That candle burns until it burns out. No one touches it. Scholars still debate if this ritual was symbolic penance, quiet mourning, or simply an emperor trying to stay human in a life that rarely allowed it. The eunuch points you toward a small alcove where visitors can leave scrolls of their own. You're given paper, a brush, a moment. You write something, it doesn't matter what, it just matters that you did. When you place it on the shelf, it feels like laying down a thought that's been standing too long. Outside, the moon has begun its climb. The stars are soft tonight and bothered, half-shy, and the palace hums with a quiet that doesn't feel empty. It feels held. Asterisk mid-morning drifts into the palace like a bored noble slow, overdressed, and mildly curious about how everyone's been surviving without it. The air is warmer today, and the paper screens rattle lazily against their frames, as though they, too, are trying to decide whether it's worth the effort to hold it all together. You are summoned, though summoned is a strong word, let's say, politely retrieved by a court official wearing a sash to long for his own good. It trails behind him like a small, decorative ghost, your destination, the room of questions not asked. It's not on any map, and the official, who refuses to give his name, speaks only in vague phrases like "you'll understand once you hear." The silence, and "don't step on the 3rd floorboard from the left." When you arrive, you find yourself in a dim chamber filled with blank scrolls, unlit lanterns, and a peculiar sense of waiting. There are no guards, no monks, no obvious caretakers. Just the soft rustle of time doing its thing. At the center of the room sits a single low table with one object on it. A wooden box, sealed with string, marked only with the character for why you don't open it. You're not supposed to. That's the point. Your historical fact. The Song dynasty placed an unusually high value on not knowing certain things. In some branches of official bureaucracy, it was considered wise to omit questions that couldn't be answered without destabilizing harmony. The absence of inquiry, when done well, was considered a kind of statecraft. In this chamber, important questions, ones that were too dangerous, too philosophical, or just too heartbreakingly human, were written, sealed, and never spoken of again. Here's your cultural tidbit. Once sealed in this room, questions are believed to lose their weight in the afterlife, a mercy for the soul who carried them. Some say ghosts visit the room not for answers, but to remember the sensation of not knowing. You wander past a shelf labeled Imperial Dilemmas, another unfinished apologies. The most crowded shelf reads, Things We Never Admitted. You pause beside a scroll with no title and no seal. You feel something from it, not a chill exactly, more like recognition. You leave it untouched. Scholars still debate whether this room ever influenced policy, or if it was just a quiet place for the overburdened to rest their minds. But its presence in court records, however faint, suggests it mattered. You sit for a while on a silk cushion, listening, and for a brief, drowsy moment, it feels like the room is listening back. When you leave, the official is waiting. He says nothing, just bows. Sometimes. The best answers are the ones you don't drag into daylight. It's raining again, lightly, the kind of rain that seems more interested in being poetic than useful. You walk the covered corridor outside the main garden, the soles of your shoes clicking softly on the damp tiles. A pair of sparrows argue in a nearby tree about what, you're not sure. But one of them seems to have very strong opinions about moss placement. Today, you're accompanying the emperor on his lesser-known afternoon ritual, the hour of listening to nothing. It's held in a secluded tea pavilion at the edge of the garden, rarely used, modestly furnished, and famously devoid of activity. You arrive before the emperor does, which is common. He likes to be a little late to nothing. The pavilion itself is simple. Just 4 pillars, a raised platform, and a view of a pond where koi glide like ideas, half remembered. A servant brings a tea tray with 2 cups. One is placed across from you. No one touches it. Your historical fact. Gawazong was known for his silences. Many official records mention hours of non-speaking in court, which scholars believe were intentional gestures of thought or quiet protests. He often expressed policy decisions through pauses, gestures, and long, unreadable sips of tea. You sit and wait. The tea cools. The breeze changes direction 3 times. Eventually, the emperor arrives. He does not greet you. He does not need to. You're not really here. After all, not in a way that interrupts. He pours tea. He doesn't drink it. You both stare out at the rain. And here's your obscure cultural tidbit. In some Song households, rain was considered a sign that the dead were clearing their throats before speaking. Families would gather in silence and simply listen, so you do. The emperor breathes slowly. His shoulders shift once. Then again, you think you see the tiniest of smiles, or maybe it's just your own reflection in the tea. Historians still debate whether these sessions were meditative practices, coded political gestures, or just the emperor's personal rebellion against being required to constantly have opinions. Either way, something shifts in the room. Not loudly, just enough. He rises, without ceremony, and leaves. The second teacup remains full. You sit for a little while longer, and in the rain's rhythm, you swear you hear something soft, not a voice, but maybe a memory, or the sound of history, letting itself breathe. Asterisk, the late afternoon is thick and golden, the kind of light that clings to the edges of leaves and wraps itself lazily around pillars. The air feels syrupy with calm. Even the cicadas sound half-hearted, like they've forgotten what they were complaining about. You're guided, slowly, to the hall of soft requisite, lesser archive, one rarely visited by officials, and certainly never mentioned in court debates. It's where they store the things that didn't quite count as history, but refused to leave. Inside, the walls are lined with shelves that sag under the weight of paper dreams, unfinished letters, children's drawings sent from villagers, recipes attributed to aunt who cooked with magic, and records of things that might have happened, or might have been dreams. A middle-aged woman with grey-streaked hair and eyes like tired kindness greets you. She's the keeper of footnotes. Yes, that's a real title. Her job is to curate and protect the margins of empire, the anecdotes, jokes, and small stories not important enough to feature in annals, but too loved to throw away. She hands you a scroll labelled Incident with the bamboo spoon. still unresolved. You don't open it. You don't need to. You understand the spirit of the place now. Your historical fact. Song dynasty scholars often annotated official records with small, personal comments marginalia that sometimes carried more truth than the records themselves. These notes have become vital sources for understanding the lives of people history tried to skip. There's a whole section here devoted to lies that felt true, another 2 truths no one believed, and 1 narrow, shelf-labeled, definitely didn't happen, but still beautiful. You pass a scroll with a single line. My father once heard a poem recited by thunder. Below it, someone has added, in smaller ink, we let him keep that story. Your obscure tidbit for this visit. Couriers in the Southern Song were sometimes instructed to memorize verses along with their official messages. The belief was that poetry, carried with news, softened the blow of bad tidings, or at least made the emperor seem more cultured while delivering disappointment. You sit beside a stack of letters that were written but never sent. Some are addressed to mothers, others to childhood friends, one to a god that no longer has a temple, the keeper tells you. We read them once a year, to remind the air what kindness sounds like. Historians still debate whether these footnote archives were tolerated or simply ignored because no one knew what to do with them. But someone always kept writing. Morning arrives on tiptoe. It doesn't wake you with a flourish, just slowly unrolls itself over your room like a cautious guest laying down a borrowed blanket. The light is soft, almost unsure, and the silence lingers like a dream that doesn't quite want to leave. You rise, stretch, and step into your slippers, which have been turned just slightly escuous. Though someone tried to be helpful but didn't understand shoe geometry, you decide to forgive the ghost. It's early today. You're being sent to the Bureau of Scented Records. Yes, it exists. Yes, it smells exactly how it sounds like an apothecary opened a love letter inside a scroll vault. The bureau is hidden behind the perfumery wing, and its contents are rarely discussed. That's because its archives aren't written in words. They're written in fragrance. Scrolls and slips of cloth are infused with custom scents meant to evoke events, people, and moments too delicate or personal for the written record. This, according to the archivist, lets memory bypass language. Your historical fact, while not widespread, there are records of Song dynasty courtiers using scent as a mnemonic and symbolic tool. Perfumed silk, resin-infused wax seals, and even incense-coded instructions were part of a larger effort to create emotional texture around information. You're given a cloth sealed in a jade box. You open it and inhale slowly. Jasmine, sandalwood, and a faint whiff of burnt sugar. The archivist says that's the scent of a farewell between lovers who promised not to remember each other. You nod, then wonder how often that's been, promised and broken. Your obscure tidbit. Once a year, the emperor walks through this hall alone. He doesn't take any scrolls. He just smells 5 at random, bows to each, and leaves. His attendants call it the Invisible Council. Historians still debate whether this bureau was truly respected or just politely tolerated by more serious officials. But no one denies the serenity it creates, and no one ever enters without permission. As you leave, the scent clings to your robe. You don't mind. Some stories are best remembered through breath. The sky is unusually clear today, like it was scrubbed by a particularly detail-oriented deity. Light glints off tiled roofs. Birds make dramatic loops in the air just because they can. and the palace cats are sunbathing like furry nobles on vacation. You are summoned to the imperial gamekeeper's quarters, not for hunting that would require far more enthusiasm than anyone here has today, but for an inspection of the silent menagerie. The gamekeeper, a sprightly man with boots too shiny to trust, leads you through a side gate into a small enclosed garden. No animals, just dozens of exquisitely carved wooden figures, foxes, cranes, turtles, lions, each perched in its own alcove, each facing slightly different directions. These, he says, are the Emperor's memory beasts. Your historical fact, goes on in his later years, developed a fondness for animal symbolism, commissioning artisans to craft specific memory effigies in the shapes of creatures tied to past events, people, or feelings. They weren't worshipped or played with, they were simply remembered. You pause in front of a curled stone dog. Loyalty, the gamekeeper says, then gestures to a rabbit with one ear turned sideways. Miscalculated kindness. There's a tiger with its eyes closed. Victory that cost too much. You pass a particularly mournful carp, carved from dark sandalwood. No explanation. You don't ask. Here's your cultural tidbit. In some Song households, it was tradition to place small animal tokens under pillows to encourage certain dreams. A swallow for good news, a piglet for sleep without regret, a deer for someone to return. Historians still debate whether the Emperor's menagerie was a personal archive or a symbolic warning to successors, but its existence speaks volumes about a ruler who preferred carved silence to court gossip. Before you go, the gamekeeper hands you a bird no larger than your palm. It's made of rice paper and gold thread. Take it, he says, not to keep, just to listen to. It says nothing, which somehow feels like enough. By the time you return to the inner court, the light has shifted. It glows, no, not brightly, but in the way a lantern glows just before sleep, claims the room. Today is the festival of slowed words. No, it's not a joke. It's a yearly ritual held in one of the quiet halls, where courtiers and monks gather to speak only in measured, thoughtful cadence, pausing between each sentence to taste the silence before the next. You are invited as an observer. They hand you a cushion, a cup of lotus tea, and a polite nod. The Emperor arrives late, not out of disrespect. He's waiting for his words to feel ready. Your historical fact, in the Song era, speech was often considered a tool best used sparingly. Officials were encouraged to speak only when needed and to weigh words against silence. Some ceremonial councils were timed not to end, but to slow, ensuring no decision was rushed. One by one, people stand and share something, a thought, a story, a memory, between each person, a silence that stretches like fabric being slowly folded. You sip your tea. It's warm, a little bitter. You like it more than you expected. Your obscure tidbit. On this day, no bell is rung in the palace. Time is marked only by how long the tea takes to cool. A young clerk stands and says, "I once spoke too quickly. It cost the friendship." He sits. Everyone bows slightly. The Emperor finally stands. He says only, "Some things become sacred because we stop speaking them," then sits again. Scholars still debate whether this event held official status, or was more of a private practice among the literati. Regardless, it remains one of the most attended days in the calendar. You leave the hall lighter than you entered, not because of anything you heard, but because of everything you didn't. You wake later than usual. The sun is already elbowing its way through the curtains. Someone has left a peach on your windowsill. No note, No explanation, just the fruit. Today's journey is different. You're not walking through the palace, but beneath it. A narrow stairwell behind the kitchen leads you down to the Echo Volta place few speak of, and even fewer remember visiting. It's cool, dry, and filled with stone tablets, sealed urns, and boxes of soil from different provinces. You're told this is where the empire keeps its unanswered oaths. Your historical fact, the Song dynasty, with its vast bureaucracy, recorded more than laws and taxes. It also documented personal oaths, promises made under seal to serve, protect, or confess. When these oaths were broken or remained unresolved, they were placed here. A monk walks you past a row of sealed jars. These contain voices, he says, on paper, but also in air. You pass an urn labeled, "I swore I'd return another. If she forgives me, I will never speak again." It's quiet in the vault, but not empty. The silence is dense, the kind that feels like it's listening. Here's your obscure cultural detail. Some believed that certain words carried weight even after the speaker died. To prevent wandering truths, these vows were sealed in clay, with a piece of the speaker's clothing, just in case. Historians still debate whether this practice was superstition or an early attempt at bureaucratic closure. Regardless, the records remain silent, patient. You're given a chance to leave something, a thought, an apology, a wish. You whisper it into a jar, seal it, and place it beside the others. No one asks what you said. No one needs to. When you ascend back into daylight, it feels brighter than before, because now the words aren't weighing you down. Asterisk, the sun dips behind the palace roofs like it's too tired to argue with evening. You're standing in a quiet courtyard where moss has won the war against stone, and a single pomegranate tree leans like it's telling secrets to the wall. Tonight is not about ceremony, or memory, or even ghosts. Tonight is about laughter. You've been invited to the Hall of Forgotten Jokes. Yes, it's real. Once a year, the court gathers to retell the jokes that never landed, the puns that didn't quite make sense, and the stories that ended with ... I guess you had to be there. A lantern is lit, a scroll unrolled. The emperor begins with a tale about a minister, a goat, and a misinterpreted proverb. It makes no sense. Everyone laughs anyway. Your historical fact. Even during high formality, the Song court embraced humor. Scholars kept joke books, emperors hosted comedic performers, and certain banquets ended with rounds of poetic riddles, some of which were just terrible on purpose. Tonight, servants, poets, and nobles take turns sharing their best, worst attempts at humor. Someone tells a story about a dream where their horse wrote them a letter of resignation. Another shares a riddle so bad it causes actual coughing. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some believed that laughing at a failed joke could appease restless spirits who found sincerity more amusing than perfection. The emperor tells a final joke. It's bad, very bad, but his smile is real, and that's enough. Historians still debate whether this tradition was official or just a rebellion against too much solemnity. But for one night, the court feels human. You walk home under a sky filled with soft stars and the echo of someone snorting mid-giggle. It's the sound of history loosening its collar and letting joy have the final word. The sun dips behind the palace roofs like it's too tired to argue with evening. You're standing in a quiet courtyard where moss has won the war against stone, and a single pomegranate tree leans like it's telling secrets to the wall. Tonight is not about ceremony, or memory, or even ghosts. Tonight is about laughter. You've been invited to the Hall of Forgotten Jokes. Yes, it's real once a year. The court gathers to retell the jokes that never landed, the puns that didn't quite make sense, and the stories that ended with ... I guess you had to be there. A lantern is lit. A scroll unrolled. The emperor begins with a tale about a minister, a goat, and a misinterpreted proverb. It makes no sense. Everyone laughs anyway. Your historical fact. Even during high formality, the song court embraced humor. Scholars kept joke books, emperors hosted comedic performers, and certain banquets ended with rounds of poetic riddles, some of which were just terrible on purpose. Tonight, servants, poets, and nobles take turns sharing their best, worst attempts at humor. Someone tells a story about a dream where their horse wrote them a letter of resignation. Another shares a riddle so bad it causes actual coughing. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some believed that laughing at a failed joke could appease restless spirits who found sincerity more amusing than perfection. The emperor tells a final joke. It's bad, very bad, but his smile is real, and that's enough. Historians still debate whether this tradition was official or just a rebellion against too much solemnity. But for one night, the court feels human. You walk home under a sky filled with soft stars and the echo of someone's snorting. Mid-giggle, it's the sound of history loosening its collar and letting joy have the final word. Asterisk, the morning is bright but gentle, as if the sun peeked in, saw you weren't quite ready for anything demanding, and decided to keep things mellow. A faint breeze carries the scent of wood smoke and rice porridge. Somewhere, a bell chimes once, then changes its mind about chiming again. You've been summoned not urgently to the Office of Errors and Retraction. Yes, that's what it's called. It occupies a small, slouching building near the back of the palace compound, wedged between the herbarium and the turtle pond. You wouldn't notice it if someone didn't point. Inside, the walls are covered with scrolls pinned and repinned, most with corrections scribbled in the margins. Incorrect. Date. Apology issued. Should have double-checked. And the ever-useful, never mind. A sleepy-looking scribe with a crooked ink stain on his robe waves you in. This, he says, is where we keep the mistakes. Your historical fact. Song bureaucracies were meticulous in record-keeping, but they were also refreshingly open to admitting mistakes. Entire offices were dedicated to revisions, retractions, and the cataloguing of official There was even a yearly ceremony to burn the most embarrassing ones. He hands you a scroll. It reads, "We regret to inform the court that General Liu's victory was actually a well-hosted dinner party misinterpreted by our messenger. Numbered provinces were captured. Spirits remain high." You smile. The scribe nods. There's a shelf marked Poems Reconsidered. Another labeled Wrong Names, Right Feelings. One scroll is simply titled, "Oops." Your obscure tidbit. Palace staff used to place miniature paper fans inside apology scrolls, symbolizing the hope of cooling tempers. Some were perfumed. Others had tiny doodles of bowing cats. Historians still debate whether the emperor personally read these records or prefer to let his ministers absorb the collective embarrassment. Either way, this place exists. Before leaving, the scribe offers you a blank scroll and a brush. Anything you'd like to take back. You write something, fold it. He files it without reading, and you feel lighter than before. Turns out, even in empires, grace begins with "I was wrong." The air outside is unusually still, as if the wind is holding its breath. The garden you walk through is lined with wintergreen and clove trees, their leaves rustling just enough to remind you they're alive. The emperor is attending a private tea ceremony in the pavilion of unfinished thoughts. You've been quietly invited to observe. The pavilion sits in a secluded corner, its walls made entirely of hanging beads and slow-moving fans. Inside, there are no chairs, just silk mats, low tables, and cups, so thin they tremble when you look at them too quickly. The tea served here is rare. Not because it's expensive, but because it's brewed only halfway. The leaves are steeped just long enough to start speaking, but not long enough to finish their sentence. It's meant to evoke potential, your historical fact, in the Southern song. Certain artistic and intellectual circles embraced incompletion as a virtue, believing that some truths were more powerful when hinted at, not delivered in full. Paintings would deliberately leave landscapes open-ended. Poems would end midline. Even architecture sometimes featured a missing stone, symbolizing humility in the face of perfection. The emperor drinks his tea, pauses, and says only, almost. Everyone nods, like that word was enough to summarize the entire morning. You're handed a blank fan and a brush. You're asked to write something incomplete. You write the first half of a wish, then fold the fan. It's added to a display near the center, joining dozens of other fans fluttering gently in the breeze created by nothing in particular. Your obscure tidbit in this pavilion. Servants whisper their thoughts rather than speak aloud, not to be secretive, but because every phrase is expected to linger in the air like perfume, not land like a command. Historians still debate whether this ceremony had practical function or was merely the emperor's favorite excuse to escape paperwork. One scroll refers to it as a meditation on maybes. You sip the tea, it's warm, green, floral and frustrating. You love it. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a story can do is refuse to end, and sometimes a half-spoken truth speaks the loudest. The morning sky looks washed and well-behaved, like it put on its best silk for a polite audience. The palace feels unusually choreographed. Today's servants moving with practiced elegance, courtiers gliding rather than walking. Even the birds seem to have rehearsed their entrances. That's because today is the day of names said aloud. You haven't heard of it. Most haven't. It's not written in calendars or sung in festivals. But once a year, the emperor walks the North Corridor and speaks names. Not titles, not ranks, just names. You are permitted to follow, as long as you don't ask questions. The procession begins shortly after breakfast. No ceremony, no music. The emperor walks slowly, his hands behind his back, pausing at certain places in the corridor to say a name aloud. Yun, Fei, Shi. Each name is spoken like it's still listening. Then silence follows, long enough for the wind to carry it somewhere secret. Your historical fact, Gaozong, was known for remembering the personal names of even low-ranking attendants, gardeners, and former courtiers long since dismissed or deceased. This tradition, though unofficial, is documented in the journals of palace scribes as the emperor's quiet roll call of the heart. As he continues, a servant approaches you quietly and places a small clay tablet in your palm. It's blank, you're told. At sunset, break it. Say a name, any name, no instructions beyond that. Your obscure tidbit in some song burial rituals. Clay tablets were left unmarked so that the dead could name themselves in the afterlife, choosing whichever name best matched the memory they wished to keep. Historians still debate whether this practice originated in court or countryside, but its symbolism is clear. Not all names need ink to survive by day's end. The emperor turns and nods at the corridor's final arch. No grand finish, no explanation. He walks away alone. That evening, you step into the garden, hold the clay tablet gently, and whisper the name you've been carrying. It breaks in two, and the silence that follows feels heard. The next morning arrives wearing rain, not storm, not drizzle. That rare, velvety rain that seems like it has nowhere else to be, and every reason to stay. The palace slows down in response. Robes get heavier, footsteps soften, and the sounds of sweeping become a kind of music. You're sent to the conservatory of things that only exist once. It's a strange little structure just past the southern lotus pools. It smells faintly of ink, wet wood, and orange peel. Inside are shelves of scrolls, boxes, and fragile objects that no one's allowed to replicate. An old man with hair like fog meets you. He introduces himself simply as the curator. You ask what exactly this conservatory holds. Things that refuse to happen again, he says. He shows you a scroll of a poem written in a dialect no one speaks anymore. A painted fan that melted slightly the moment it was finished. A porcelain bowl with an internal crack that sings a perfect note when touched with tea, but only once. Your historical fact. The Song dynasty's artisans deeply appreciated impermanence. While perfection was valued, there was also reverence for the unreproducibly objects that occurred only once, either by accident or divine timing. Some were destroyed on purpose, to keep their rarity sacred. You're invited to sit in a corner room where a performer will recite a story written just last night. The rule: it will never be repeated. Not allowed. Not in writing. Not even as a rumor. You listen, it's beautiful, then it's gone. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some tea houses, traveling storytellers were paid extra to not repeat their best tales. The belief was that the story chose that moment, and anyone trying to recapture it was chasing smoke. Historians still debate whether this was romantic idealism or clever marketing. Either way, it made people listen more carefully. As you leave, the curator hands you a thin sliver of wood burned on one end. A fragment of a flute, he says. The rest was played once, then given to the river. You don't ask why. You hold it like a whisper in your pocket. And outside, the rain continues, unhurrying, unrepeating, unmistakably now. Asterisk, the palace today smells like ink and toasted rice. A comforting sort of morning where everything feels a little rounder at the edge, softer, slower, easier to carry. You're summoned not urgently. Nothing ever is here to a circular chamber tucked behind the imperial schoolhouse. It's called the Room of Answers that didn't help. The eunuch who escorts you offers no explanation, just gestures, bows, and disappears down a hallway that looks suspiciously like it loops. The room itself is quiet. Not empty, just quiet, in the way a place gets when it knows it's done trying to explain itself. Scrolls line the walls, each wrapped in faded silk with titles like Why He Left, The Map We Lost Twice, and If the Stars Were Closer, Would You Stay? A young woman in scholar's robes, eyes, kind, ink-stained sleeves, welcomes you. These are the truths that weren't useful, she says. Accurate, yes, but not helpful. You nod, which feels correct. Your historical fact, Song dynasty. Scholars often categorized knowledge into 3 levels: useful, beautiful, and true. Some writings were preserved not for their function, but because they contained emotional clarity, even if they solved nothing. These were stored here, unofficially, for quiet reference. She shows you a scroll written by a dying scribe. It details, in exquisite calligraphy, how a misunderstanding over punctuation led to a 7-year border dispute. The last line reads, "We corrected it. It didn't matter." Your obscure tidbit. A rare song tradition held that some scrolls were meant only to be read once and then copied slightly wrong, as a reminder that even understanding can go astray and survive. Historians still debate whether this room existed formally or was created by over-sentimental clerks. Either way, it holds a strange kind of peace. Before you go, she offers you a scroll. It has no title, no author, just a single sentence. You were right, but they still didn't stay. You bow, return it, and walk out lighter, if not wiser. Sometimes, knowing changes nothing, but it still feels good to know. Afternoon unfolds like silk unraveling in water slow, shimmering and in no rush to be a shape. You're led through a side gate you've never noticed before, its frame marked with delicate carvings of clouds and question marks. Yes, literal question marks. Stylized, of course, but still, the courtyard beyond is known as the place between versions. It's a garden, but barely, overgrown, full of partially built stone paths that stop mid-step, bamboo fences that lead nowhere, a koi pond with no fish. Only ripples dot at the center stands a storyteller. She's old not in the brittle way, but in the scene several emperors come and go way. Her voice is soft, but every word lands like a leaf, deciding where to rest. She tells you a version of the emperor's rise that contradicts everything you've heard before. No battles, no grand betrayals, just a long walk home, a quiet apology, and an agreement made beneath a tree. You ask if it's true. She smiles. It was once. Your historical fact. Court historians in the Song dynasty were expected to write multiple drafts of imperial biographies, one for official archives, one for family records, and one sensitive version that remained sealed until decades later. Often, these versions disagreed. In this courtyard, all the discarded versions are told again, not to correct the record, just to remind the heir that history, too, has moods. Here's your obscure tidbit. In rural tea houses, traveling monks would offer alternate endings to famous stories in exchange for rice balls. The tradition, called echoweaving, was believed to help keep history from becoming rigid. Historians still debate whether these alternate stories influenced governance or were just tolerated as cultural seasoning. One emperor reportedly ordered 3 storytellers to tell the same tale differently and picked the one that felt truest. The woman finishes her tale. You don't ask questions. Instead, you sit with it, all of it. The half-truths, the maybe memories, the stories that conflict but still ring somewhere deep. You leave through a path that wasn't there when you arrived, and maybe that's the point. Asterisk. The sun doesn't rise today so much as it stretches itself across the sky, reluctant and tangled in cloud thread. The palace wears the grey light well. You, on the other hand, find it a bit too honest. This is the kind of day that makes memories surface like frogs after rain. You're invited quietly, respectfully, with a slightly bowed head to the hall of paused grief. It's not on any tour, no guidebooks, no plaques. The room is cool, round, lined with pale grey silk. A single bronze bowl rests in the center. filled with water so still it reflects not your face, but the space behind you. You try not to look. An attendant approaches, offering no name and speaking in a voice that might be wind with opinions. This room, they say, is for what you aren't ready to mourn, your historical fact. In the later years of the Southern Song, there was a growing philosophical movement that believed grief, when rushed, became fragmented. Some scholars proposed rituals to pause mourning to hold it, like a fruit not yet ripe. Certain rooms were designated as grief-holding spaces, where nothing would be asked of the mourner except presence. You sit in the room. There are no stories told here, no incense, no music, only the quiet company of things not yet healed. Across from you, a woman sits with her hands folded over a silk bundle. She doesn't speak. Her eyes meet yours. She nods, not in greeting, but in permission. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some Song dynasty households stitched small velvet pouches filled with dried rose petals and sandalwood, labeled with the names of people they hadn't yet cried for. These were worn under clothing on anniversaries. After the third year, the pouch was burned. With no words spoken, historians still debate whether these rituals were healing or avoidance, but none debate their quiet, enduring grace. You're invited to whisper something into the bowl, not aloud, just a breath thick enough with meaning to sink. You lean close, the surface ripples, and then stills again. When you rise to leave, you feel unchanged, and yet something small inside has been set down, not finished, just no longer needing to be held so tightly. Evening tiptoes in, trailing the scent of warm earth and lavender ash. You're guided through a corridor that curves strangely, like it forgot how straight lines work. At the end is a narrow door, carved with no symbols, just a single, perfect, circled dot inside. The room is dim, lit by low lanterns that don't so much illuminate as agree to exist beside you. You've come to the gallery of time spent well. It isn't grand or impressive. There are no murals or gold leaf, only objects placed with immense care on stone shelves. A half-worn brush, a cracked teacup, a shoe with no pair, a child's toy fox with one button eye missing. These, says the guide, are the emperor's favorite moments. You ask how he chose them. They're the ones he never had to explain. Your historical fact. Emperor Gaozong reportedly kept a private collection of mundane personal effects tied to small, emotionally vivid memories. Though largely undocumented, whispers in court memoirs describe his fondness for humble souvenirs. One account mentions him once keeping a plumpet for a year because it reminded him of a single afternoon with someone who made him laugh. You walk slowly, shelf by shelf. Each object holds its own gravity. A candle stub, labeled only when she read the poem wrong, and I didn't correct her. Alaka Kum, the day my daughter forgave me, without saying so. A piece of silk with a wine stain. They sang off-key. I've never heard anything more right. Your obscure tidbit. In some song homes, families kept a quiet drawer filled with items that didn't have purpose, only feeling. When guests asked about them, hosts would only say, "That's part of the story I keep." Historians still debate if the emperor's gallery was ever meant to be seen. But now and then, someone is invited in. No questions are allowed, just presence. Before you leave, the guide hands you a small, weightless object wrapped in cloth. You don't open it. You don't need to. You know what it is, and more importantly, why you're not ready to name it just yet. Asterisk, the sky tonight is deep indigo, the kind of color that feels like it's listening, Stars blink in slowly, one by one, like they've agreed not to overwhelm you. You're led through a garden that hasn't been trimmed in years. Vines spill over walls, moss takes liberties with old statues, and somewhere nearby, frogs conduct a sleepy symphony. You're not told where you're going, you're just told it's almost time. The path narrows, the air cools, and then through a half-crumbled gate you arrive at the pavilion of final tea. There's only one table, one kettle, one cup. You sit and wait. Eventually, the emperor arrives not in robes of state, but in ordinary travel where, like someone about to leave and not come back for a while, he nods once, sits across from you. No words are exchanged. The kettle boils slowly. When the tea is poured, it's not served with ceremony. There's no fanfare, no poetic flourishes, just steam rising like memory without narrative. He takes a sip, so do you. Your historical fact, Song Dynasty. Rulers often performed a personal ritual before death, real or symbolic, where they drank a final cup of tea alone or with someone trusted. It wasn't a goodbye, it was an honoring of stillness, of having lived long enough to slow down. You sit there together in silence. The emperor doesn't tell you a story. Instead, he tells you a single sentence. The ghosts are full now. I've fed them everything. Then he closes his eyes. Not in sleep, not in death, just rest. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some rural temples, monks leave a final bowl of tea each month on the full moon, not for the gods, but for all the words they chose not to say aloud. Historians still debate whether this moment, the emperor's last tea, actually happened. Some say he died in a storm, others claim he vanished into the mountains. But in this version, the one you're sitting in, it ends with tea, and with someone choosing not to say goodbye. You stay seated long after he rises and leaves. The tea is cold now, but it still tastes like something finished and something forgiven. Asterisk, let go, just for now. The corridor back is quiet, and it feels different, hollowed out by the weight of what came before, but somehow easier to walk. The wind has picked up slightly, not enough to chill, just enough to remind you the world still moves. You're guided, for the last time today, to a quiet balcony overlooking the garden where this all began. You sit, no one joins you, which is perfect. The sounds are gentle, a reed flute in the distance, water trickling over stone, the occasional rustle of bamboo speaking to no one in particular. You've reached the softest part of the story, not its climax, not its conclusion, just the moment where everything stops trying to matter so much. Your historical fact. Late in his life, Gaozong commissioned a set of wind chimes tuned to the tonal pattern of a lullaby his mother once hummed. He placed them near the lotus pond and forbade anyone to oil them. Let the rust teach them softness, he said. Tonight, those same chimes sing. Their notes don't form a melody, just echoes of one, enough to suggest comfort without pressing it upon you. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some corners of the Southern song, older poets believed that one unwritten poem always floated above the palace, invisible but felt. If you were very quiet, they said, you could hear its pauses. You sit there, listening, and you begin to notice the pauses more than the sounds. The spaces between wind, the hush between footsteps, the quiet between your own thoughts. Historians do not debate this place, because they do not know it exists. And maybe that's the point. The final scroll in your sleeve feels heavy, but you don't open it. You just hold it as the sky darkens to the exact shade of forgetting, and the palace, like a tired old friend, sighs once and sleeps. Asterisk, the morning after feels like an exhale you didn't know you were holding. The sky is washed soft blue, pale and empty as a promise made without expectation. The palace is quieter than usual, like even the walls are letting themselves rest a little. You don't have anywhere to be today, but you go walking anyway. Your feet lead you back to places you've already been, corridors once brimming with. Ritual now seems smaller, almost familiar. The pavilion of unfinished thoughts still ripples with its soft fans, though no one is inside. The hall of paused grief hums gently behind its stone door, waiting without waiting. Eventually, you end up in the garden again, the one from your first day. The same stone path, the same sleepy koi, the same half-listening trees, except something's changed. You're carrying it differently now. Your historical fact, in the final years of Gozong's reign, he was said to walk the palace grounds alone, revisiting each chamber not to rule, but to remember how ruling had once felt. He left behind no journal, only a collection of small, handwritten labels, pinned discreetly to doorways, each one a single word. Almost, still, enough. You find one of those today. Tucked behind a lantern near the garden wall, it says again. You smile. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some song courtiers believed that a memory, if revisited quietly enough, could be gently rewritten, erased, just softened. They called this cloud editing. Historians still debate whether Gozong ever truly let go of his need for legacy. Some say the quiet walks were his final power. Others believe they were just his way of becoming a man again, rather than a symbol. Either way, the garden remembers him, and now, perhaps, remembers you too. You sit by the pond. A koi drifts by lazily. You drop a plum petal into the water. It floats for a while, then gently sinks. The moment doesn't need meaning, it just needs to have happened. Dusk returns like an old friend knocking gently. Just one tap, then silence, as if waiting for you to decide whether or not to answer. You do. You're escorted, though more gently now, with less ceremony, to the vault of last things. It's not locked. Inside, there's no grandeur. Just a simple room filled with objects that were never claimed. A single slipper, a scroll with no signature, a cup still half full with long cold tea, a robe folded so carefully it feels like someone meant to come back for it. The attendant explains softly, these are not lost, just no longer expected. Your historical fact. Some Song dynasty courts kept vaults of abandoned belongings, particularly of officials who vanished, died unexpectedly, or were quietly erased from court records. These items were neither destroyed nor reused. They were simply kept so they wouldn't become ghosts. You pause in front of a broken flute, not shattered, just slightly cracked along the mouthpiece. It rests atop a velvet cloth embroidered with clouds. The label simply reads, "Played once, then silence." You ask if the emperor ever visited this room. The attendant smiles. Every winter solstice, alone. He never spoke during those visits, only listened. Here's your obscure tidbit. In certain provinces, it was customary to leave one object behind when departing a home permanently, so the spirit of the space wouldn't feel entirely abandoned. Historians still debate the purpose of the Vault of Last Things. Some saw it as a gentle form of historical guilt. Others viewed it as a promise that nothing would be forgotten unless it chose to be. You find a shelf with a dozen folded notes, all sealed. One has your name on it. You don't open it. You hold it, and that's enough. Outside, the lanterns begin to glow soft, flickering, undecided between staying and leaving. You walk out slowly. Behind you, the vault remains quiet, not forgotten, not remembered. Just there, like the last page of a book you're not quite ready to close. Asterisk, you wake to bird song soft, not eager, not the kind that demands your attention, but the kind that says, you're still here. That's enough. The air is light. You stretch, not to begin a day, but to thank your body for carrying you quietly through so many others. There's no summons today. No parchment slipped under the door. No delicate knock. Only a folded piece of plum-colored silk left on your windowsill, warmed by the morning sun. Inside it, a single tea leaf, silver-tipped, familiar. You already know where to go. You pass the places you've learned by heart, the hall of forgotten jokes, the courtyard of almosts, the pavilion where thoughts float like unfinished poems. Each nods to you in silence, as if the palace itself knows the end of the story is near, and it's trying not to wake it too soon. The garden waits, still, not empty. He is there, the emperor, older than the last time, or perhaps just quieter. His robes are simpler now, trimmed in twilight instead of gold. He pours 2 cups, motions for you to sit. No ghosts join you this time, or maybe they do, but are tired of being seen. He doesn't speak at first, neither do you. This is a language you both have learned by now, the steeping of silence. He finally says, "This is the last tea." You nod. You knew. He smiles, not sadly, just like someone who has taken off a heavy crown and realized the world didn't fall. "Tell me," he says, "what did you find in my empire of nearlies and almosts?" You take a long breath. The tea is sweet, floral, strange. You answer slowly, the way he once taught you. "I found a history that wasn't trying to win, just to rest." He closes his eyes. That, it seems, was the right answer. Asterisk, there is no ceremony, no final procession. The emperor rises and begins walking, and you follow like you've done a dozen times before. The path is familiar, but quieter now. The trees don't rustle quite as loud. The lanterns flicker like they've forgotten their lines. You arrive at a long hallway, one you've never seen before. Its doors are tall and strange. Some are round, some are crooked. Some shimmer faintly like dreams you almost remembered. "These," he says, "are the rooms that remember me." He opens one. Inside, a tiny kitchen, a kettle long cold, a handwritten recipe for a soup you can't pronounce. He smiles. "Once, I cooked here. Badly," she laughed. "That was enough." He opens another, a library with only one book. Its cover says, "For when it rains." He doesn't open it. Neither do you. It doesn't need to be read to be known. Your historical fact, toward the end of his reign. Gaozong spent entire days walking through unused palace rooms, not to reclaim them, but to let them exist without function. He called them his ghost galleries. No one was allowed to clean them. You walk in silence. He opens one final door. A garden, smaller than the others, overgrown. In its center, a stone table, and on it, a single scroll. "This," he says, "was meant to be my final decree." You step closer. The scroll is blank. "I changed my mind," he adds. "Here's your obscure tidbit. Some song rulers kept scrolls of silence, blank documents stored in royal archives to symbolize the power of what wasn't said. Historians still debate what Gaozong's blank scroll was meant to contain. Peace terms, a confession, a poem. The lack of content has invited more speculation than any decree ever written. You stand beside him as the wind lifts the scroll gently. He doesn't stop it. It lifts, curls, and floats away, and you watch it go not as loss, but as release. Asterisk, there is no ceremony, no final procession. The emperor rises and begins walking, and you follow like you've done a dozen times before. The path is familiar, but quieter now. The trees don't rustle quite as loud. The lanterns flicker like they've forgotten their lines. You arrive at a long hallway, one you've never seen before. Its doors are tall and strange. Some are round, some are crooked, some shimmer faintly like dreams you almost remembered. These, he says, are the rooms that remember me. He opens one. Inside, a tiny kitchen, a kettle long cold, a handwritten recipe for a soup you can't pronounce. He smiles. Once, I cooked here. Badly. She laughed. That was enough. He opens another, a library with only one book. Its cover says, "For when it rains." He doesn't open it. Neither do you. It doesn't need to be read to be known. Your historical fact toward the end of his reign. Gaozong spent entire days walking through unused palace rooms, not to reclaim them, but to let them exist without function. He called them his ghost galleries. No one was allowed to clean them. You walk in silence. He opens one final door. A garden, smaller than the others, overgrown. In its center, a stone table, and on it, a single scroll. This, he says, was meant to be my final decree. You step closer. The scroll is blank. I changed my mind, he adds. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some Song rulers kept scrolls of silence, blank documents, stored in royal archives to symbolize the power of what wasn't said. Historians still debate what Gaozong's blank scroll was meant to contain. Peace terms, a confession, a poem. The lack of content has invited more speculation than any decree ever written. You stand beside him as the wind lifts the scroll gently. He doesn't stop it. It lifts, curls, and floats away, and you watch it go not as loss, but as release. Asterisk, night falls with velvet footsteps. It does not crash. It arrives like someone tucking a blanket up to your chin. The stars above the palace feel unusually close tonight, like they've gathered here to eavesdrop. You and the emperor stand in the soft blue dark, neither of you rushing. He reaches into his robe and pulls out something small, presses it into your hand, a compass hand-carved, worn smooth, its needle trembling toward nowhere in particular. I used to follow it, he says, even when I didn't believe in where it pointed. You turn it slowly. The needle doesn't settle. It never did. Your historical fact. Navigational tools in the Song dynasty were not just for sailors. Some emperors used them symbolically, consulting a compass when making moral or political decisions. The direction wasn't as important as the ritual of asking. He motions to the garden path. Come, there's one more place. You walk until the path becomes dirt, then moss, then nothing at all. Trees arch overhead like cathedral ribs. Fireflies flicker along the edge of your vision, blinking in a code you'll never translate. Eventually, the path gives way to a hill. At the top, a stone bench, simple, weathered, facing the sky. He sits. So do you. Tell me, he says, what else have you carried? You think of the scroll you never opened, The name you whispered into the clay tablet, the scent of jasmine from the Hall of Answers that didn't help enough, you reply. And he nods. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some song philosophers believed that if a person sat still long enough with the truth of their own life, it would eventually introduce itself by name. Usually, that name was not grand, just something like quiet or later or still. You stay until the stars tire of being watched, then, slowly, you both rise. You turn to walk back to the palace, but he does not follow, and you do not ask him to. You know better now. Some partings are not departures. They're simply doors that no longer need to be opened. You walk alone, compass in your palm, the needle still dancing, and somehow that feels like peace. The wind shifts slightly today, not with urgency, just with suggestion. The silk banners in the courtyard rippled lazily, like they've remembered an old song but forgotten the words. You decide to walk, not with purpose, just to see what remains. The corridors echo less now. The murals, once crowded with painted processionals, seem to have faded slightly, as if even the stories themselves are beginning to exhale. You find yourself near the Hall of Names that weren't recorded. You've passed it before, always uncertain if it was real. Today, the door is ajar. Inside, a single scroll draped across the room like a lazy river. Names upon names, not in bold calligraphy, just simple strokes. Gentle dot, you run your fingers over one, it shimmers slightly. Your historical fact. Some song dynasties kept memory holes where the names of couriers, cooks, and minor poets were preserved in long scrolls that were never read, aloudly touched. The belief was that reading them aloud gave them weight. Touching them gave them rest. You touch 10, then 20. Then you whisper your own. The hall does not tremble, it sighs. Here's your obscure tidbit. There was a superstition in the Western provinces that if you said your own name in a silent room filled with names of the forgotten, they would remember you kindly. You walk out lighter, not because you left something behind, but because you were, just for a moment, part of something quietly kept outside. The sun peeks between clouds, and you notice, for the first time, that the shadows here are soft not because the light is weak, but because it doesn't need to insist. You sit by a fountain that hasn't worked in years, and it makes the gentlest sound, like it's remembering how to flow, or maybe just how to listen. You stay a while. You're in no rush. You never were. You just hadn't realized it yet. Asterisk, the final morning doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, like a guest who knows exactly where the cups are kept. The air is soft as breath. You dress slowly. Each movement feels like its own farewell, not dramatic, just deliberate. The palace is quieter now, not because it is empty, but because it's resting. You walk to the pavilion of first arrival. You haven't visited it since your first day. It looks smaller now, familiar, like a coat once borrowed and finally made your own. A tray waits, one last pot of tea, a note beside it for your journey, wherever it begins again. You pour a cup, it tastes like jasmine and memory. Your historical fact in some song palaces. Travelers departing for distant journeys were given a single cup of tea at dawn, meant to be the same blend they first tasted upon arrival. A circle of flavor, like a knot untying itself gently. You sip slowly, the warmth spreads, but not just in your hands. You're not sure where the path leads now, but you feel no fear. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some travelers in the Song dynasty would carry a final pinch of tea leaves sewn into the hem of their robes for comfort, for guidance, or maybe just so something would rustle gently when the wind rose. You step outside, the garden bows in breeze, a bird calls once, a door you don't remember seeing before stands open, not waiting, just ready. You look back once, the pavilion, the shadows, the slow, steady silence, and then you walk forward. The emperor does not appear again. He doesn't need to. His story has folded itself like a paper boat on still water, and yours continues, quiet and unhurried, somewhere beyond the tea, somewhere past the ghosts, somewhere soft and finally free.